we don't play any more darts. We play chess. Darts, you have to put your dart in the middle, which has the highest value. The 10 is in the middle, so you have to go to the middle and so on. So when you build a city or a metropolis as a dartboard, no, you are, or everyone wants to be in the middle, and you get the congestion in the middle. When you are not playing darts anymore, but you are playing chess, no, each case can have a different role. And one is the bishop, the other is the knight, the other is the rook, the other is the queen, and so on. And all together, they have a strategy, and that's a metropolis.
Yes, the difference between a right strategy and a wrong one can be as significant as a game of darts and chess. Stay tuned for yet another insightful conversation. Hello and a warm welcome to yet another episode on the Mission Shunya podcast. Glad to have you on the show today, and I hope you are doing well. I have said this before, I think multiple times, but I can never get tired of it. Sustainability and the transition to a global net zero carbon economy is a massive operation, and it needs the coming together of various sectors. Sectors cannot act in isolation. And that is exactly the reason that we continue to discuss various sectors around this broad theme on this podcast channel. Today's discussion is also a big global theme. One of the sectors that is crucial in this transition is buildings. Infrastructure delivery accounts for about 30% of global carbon emissions in a year. Second to water, concrete is the most consumed material in the world. The production of cement accounts for over 8% of total greenhouse gas emissions, and the market is forecast to grow between 5 to 8% from now until 2025. And no prizes for guessing, demand for concrete is highest from the developing world. As a matter of fact, China uses more cement every 2 years than the US used during the entire 20th century. We will discuss more about cities, urban planning, and its sustainability footprint on this episode. The guest for this episode is one of the distinguished professionals in the space. He is currently a senior consultant on metropolitan management and planning for international governmental organizations like the United Nations, European Union, UN Habitat, among others. He consults as well for national and local governments directly or through consultancy firms. He has been senior urban specialist at the World Bank. Prior to that, he was also involved in an academic role as a visiting professor at the Milan Polytechnic and previously founder and director of the Master's Program of Town Planning of the University of Madrid. Well, it doesn't end there. Our guest also served in the public administration as a former elected mayor for Madrid Central District. He served as the director of strategic plan for Madrid between 1991 and 1994. Well, all this can be attributed to only one person. And with that introduction, I would like to welcome Pedro Ortiz to the show.
Very happy to be with you and India, a country I really do admire and love.
Yes, that is clearly visible from the work that you have done. So let's begin by looking at your journey and the work that you have done. I mean, you have had a long and checkered career, and it's been both in the public sector, the private sector, and you've worked for different countries as well, including in India. So how did it all begin for you, and how's the journey been so far?
Well, it started very young. At 8, I decided to be an architect because I thought the world deserved being changed. And I thought that doing architecture was the physical way of changing the world. But when I did start my career, my studies on architecture, then I started reading economy, sociology, politics, philosophy, art, and so on. And then the building was too little. When you add up all those elements to a building, it becomes a city.
Correct.
So I became an urbanist probably when I was 20, after 1 or 2 years at the university. And then when I finished, at that time, obviously, when you are 20, you do not realize the complexity of the world and the beauty of that complexity, no?
Correct.
And so when I finished my urban planning degree, I decided to go to England. I went to Oxford because being an architect wasn't enough, and I decided to do my masters, and I then I went into regional planning,
Okay.
which is another scale, a larger scale. So the mix between regional planning, which is geography, economic, and urban planning, which is a city, comes up to be metropolitan. That's the scale of metropolises, which is a new scale.
Correct.
But let me say, for those which are technically involved in shaping the world physically, that an architect, when he designs, generally designs at a scale of 150. That's now the young generations work with computers, but we, the old ones, I am 70 this year, used to have other means of designing, and we use scalimeters, and we had scales, no? And so you design at 150. When you're dealing with a square, with a street, when you're doing urban design, you design at 1/500.
Okay.
When you are doing an urban plan, no, of a city, not a too large city, but as a city, you are designing. You are not only designing, you are making decisions at the scale of 1/5,000. And then metropolitan planning is 150,000. So you see, you always have an increase of tenfold every time.
Correct.
And I won't go on, no, because when you are dealing with a country, not India, because India is a continent, it's not a country. No? But when you are dealing with a country, you are dealing at the scale of 1/500,000. When you're dealing with a continent at scale 5 million, and when you're dealing with the world as it becomes 150 million. And each scale has a different set of instruments that are required. No, in architecture, you are dealing
Correct.
with structures, light, materials, and so on, and forms. And when you go into urban planning, you are already dealing with communities and municipalities, and start with politics and so on. And obviously, when you are at the world scale, you are in geopolitics, and you are in macroeconomics, and you are in. But all those scales require a physical approach, no?
Correct.
And normally planners get lost at the metropolitan scale and even beyond, no? And so decisions are made by economists, politicians, sociologists, and other type of people. So as I was talking about my evolution, when I went to England and studied regional planning, I made the blend between urban planning and regional, and metropolitan came about. So I came back to Spain. I was keen on, as I mentioned, changing the world. No, when you are 25, you really have a lot of ideals. No,
Exactly.
so I went into the public sector. I was not keen on making money, and the private sector is limited in the capacity of implementing these large structures. No, so I went into the public sector. And in the public sector, I had to decide either if I would become a civil servant or a politician. And civil servants generally are under the control of their bosses, which are politicians. And many times those politicians are ignorant and corrupt. So I decided to avoid that kind of situation, and I became myself a politician. So for 16 years, I tried not to be either ignorant or corrupt. And it is very difficult in politics because the pressures, the interests, not only corruption in terms of money and briberies and all that. No, corruption in terms of making decisions that you know are not the correct one, are not the just ones, but you make them because the interests that have put you there required, if you want to stay there, to make that decision, helping the groups, the interests that have fostered your career. And that is terrible. That's absolutely terrible. I call that gray corruption. The black one is when you get a bribery in your bank account in Switzerland. But so I was not a good politician because I did not play that game. And I was able to stay in politics for 16 years because my technical capacities and my social concern approach was well seen by the population and by certain potential electoral benefits. But after 16 years, it was impossible. They could not corrupt me, and I had no room left to real make decisions that should change things, and so I left politics. No, but meanwhile, I was able to do relevant things like the Metropolitan Plan of Madrid with a series of infrastructures.
That is one of your landmark projects, right?
That's it. Yes, that's it. Because I was in politics and I was able to make that kind of huge decision. Now, what I do is I tell the politicians and the civil servants, top ones, what they should do, and they don't do it. They don't do it because they have already in mind their own interests and their own priorities. But as what I say is obvious, is absolutely obvious, at the end it happens. It might take 4 years if they are intelligent and responsible and they want to implement it. But if not, for instance, in Santiago de Chile, a commuter train, it has taken 20 years, and sooner or later, the suggestions I do are so obvious that they take place, but it depends on the collective intelligence of the metropolis of the place that they are able to implement it quickly or take very long time. So yes, Madrid was a place where I was able to change the shape of the metropolis from a circular one, an orbital one, with ring roads and more ring roads that only produce congestion and long jams and so on, to a reticular one, which is something that we have been doing for 3,000 years, since in the Western world, since Hippodamus de Miletus in Greece, but in India, in China, all around the world, the reticula is the basic way you really organize a territory. And the only thing I did is taking that reticula to a larger scale. Instead of working in 10 meters, 100 meters per 100 meters, squares of 100 meters, I work with the squares of, in Madrid, 5 kilometers per 5 kilometers. But those squares have to be adapted to the distance between the different municipalities within a metropolis. And those distances are related to the quality of the land, the agricultural capacity of the land, and the type of society that builds up in an urban nucleus. So you have places with the municipalities 3 kilometers away, like Piacenza in the Valley of the Po in North Italy, or in Cuba, Havana, 3 kilometers, or other places where the land is much poorer, and these units, urban units, are 15 kilometers away, like in Buenos Aires in Argentina. But that's what I did in Madrid. I changed the shape of the metropolis. I produced several very relevant infrastructures, highways and trains and airports and so on, and the shape of Madrid has changed, and it's working very well. I am very happy with that result.
Yes, that's a wonderful story and wonderful journey. Now, tell us more about the Metromatrix method. Was Madrid the first big city to adopt this, or did you find, obviously you told about the historical past where this model was adopted, but any other cities before Madrid tried and failed? Did you make any changes to the method while you did it for Madrid?
Well, I put the name. Well, someone suggested me the name. I think it's a great name, no Metromatrix. A friend of mine, when I explained the theory and so on, he said, Metromatrix. I say, well, you just name it. No, there are precedents in the world. And for instance, one of them is the New York Plan of 1929. No?
Okay.
But the issue is that to have such a vision in the great shape of a metropolis in the long term is very difficult for a politician to have it, and it's even more difficult for a politician to adopt it, because it's really changing the shape of the metropolis. I was able to, because I was in that political position, and we had a very strong majority, and we were able to introduce those innovations. No? But generally, the metro matrix is not adopted as a general system. But when I suggest a train, an airport, a port, a park, whatever, within the advices I give to governments, in my head is a metro matrix. And the result is this train, this airport, this regional park, this highway. And then I see those projects developed, and within them is the change of the DNA of the metropolis, even if they don't realize that they are changing the DNA, no? Because, for instance, in Mumbai, producing 5 years ago already, and I don't know if it has been finally adopted, but at the beginning it was introduced in the Metropolitan Plan of Mumbai, producing the Navi Mumbai project. I mean, Navi Mumbai now is congested.
Correct.
They is fully developed, and Mumbai is growing, not at too much of a pace, only 3% per year, but enough to think about the future. Navi Mumbai was introduced in 1947. So now we are already 70 years later, more than that, 72 or 74 years later. And a new vision of the expansion of Mumbai should be undertaken. And so we propose Navi Mumbai, which is a new. And so instead of going circles around Mumbai and then creating the congestion in the center and having to build on the sea, if you build in the seas because you don't know how to manage land, and that's a real problem. So we introduced that, and it was accepted. And by introducing that Navi Mumbai north-south, like Navi Mumbai is actually north-south, you're changing the pattern of the metropolis. So when I suggest these things, within them is a change of DNA,
Exactly.
And I must say that around the world there are 30 or 37 or 39 big projects. I mentioned before Santiago de Chile, but I could mention 39 that I'm not going to do so for your sake. But there are these kind of 39 big projects that have been adopted or are in the way of being implemented and really change the shape of the metropolis in the long term within the metro matrix approach. So it's not approving a plan that would be very difficult for politicians. Is more by introducing changes that will change the structure of the metropolis. Let me give you an example.
And in that example, if you can you illustrate in terms of this development? Does it save on time, cost, any other benefits like that in comparison to the conventional one?
Well, the time and cost is the cost of the infrastructure that you are going to do anyway,
Correct.
But the thing is that you are doing something which will be sustainable in the long term, instead of getting into dead end, because you are going to do something that will allow you to complement with other synergic projects that altogether produce development.
Right.
Many times the developing countries or the developing metropolis, they are not developed because they have taken very wrong decisions along the time framework. And so the good decisions are the ones that an investment is not only the benefit of that investment specifically, is the benefit of the synergies it creates with other investments, which has a multiplier effect. So instead of investing $1 and having the returns of the $1, you are investing $1 here and $1 there. Instead of having $2, you will get 3 or 4 or 5. And that is the strategy of development. Not doing things on their own and just thinking about a highway and then nothing else. You have to think about the environment. You have to think about transport, housing, productive activities, industries, and so on, and social facilities. And when you do all that together, that you get development. If you only do a hospital here and a road over there, and they are not linked, and they are not, it's going to be a mess. And developing metropolis, most of them, they work like that. They take decisions, sporadic, disjointed, incrementalist, one here, the other there, and at the end, all that does not have the benefit of that development. To give you an image that probably the listeners will understand.
Sure.
we don't play any more darts. We play chess. Darts, you have to put your dart in the middle, which has the highest value. The 10 is in the middle, so you have to go to the middle and so on. So when you build a city or a metropolis as a dartboard, everyone wants to be in the middle, and you get the congestion in the middle. And then the radial roads that go to the middle and the orbital roads get congested because the center, the guys that own that center, the land in that center, control the market. And as you know, markets should not be controlled by supply. They should be controlled by demand. That's the way markets work. And so you are producing a market controlled by supply with congestion and so on. So making ring roads and radials ends up in congestion. When you are not playing darts anymore, but you are playing chess, each case can have a different role. And one is the bishop, the other is the knight, the other is the rook, the other is the queen, and so on. And all together, they have a strategy. And that's a metropolis. When you put the metro matrix, which is this kind of reticular approach rather than the orbital one, each of the cities within play a different role, and all together they complement each other, and they create the strategy of the metropolis for positioning in a world context. So we are changing from playing darts, which is congestive and doesn't work, to playing chess, which is and once you are playing chess and you know how to play chess, where you put the queen and you put a rook and a bishop, you have won the game because you have put them in the right position. And all the other pieces of the game are going to follow the strategy that you have built with those strategic positions. And that's what we do with Metro Matrix. We take a metropolis and we see what are the position of the main pieces of that chessboard, and we set those pieces, 2 or 3, and then the game is over. You have won the game. And let me say that obviously, like in chess, it's not the king that rules the strategy of the game, is the queen.
Well,
and the king, you have to save it, which is the historical area, and you have to protect it and to save it, because if you don't have that historical background, your identity is lost and you don't know where you're going. But the queen most of the time is the international airport, which is that positions that metropolis around the world. And let's remember that we have right now 25% of the population of the world, 25% of the population of the world live in cities, metropolis, more than 1 million inhabitants. 25% of the people of the world live in those metropolis. And those metropolis are 500 of them. And those are the metropolis that really rule the world. And you have to look how to position yourself among those 500. What is the role you have to play among those 500 metropolises? And let me say that those 500 metropolis produce 75% of the GDP of the world. So 25% produce 75% of the GDP of the world.
That's a wonderful analogy to give in terms of comparisons between what the conventional methods were doing in terms of having the dartboard and the alternate method in comparison, that is the chessboard. So it's a very wonderful analogy, and I'm sure a lot of listeners would have understood the significance or the difference or the value proposition that you bring out of this model. Which brings me to my next question. The entire objective is, of course, having a better model, but it also serves a bigger purpose. You did mention early on in the conversation about sustainability. Building cities and construction takes about 30% of the global emissions. So this method definitely adds more value to the sustainability quotient. So what's your view on how this is being adopted in the other emerging metropolises that you said? Today it's less, but by 2050, I'm sure like nearly 50% of the global population will be in cities. So how are cities or the new soon-to-be metropolises emerging?
First, let's not just talk about sustainability. Sustainability is just one part of the objective of the metropolis.
Fair.
The metropolis genoma, the DNA of the metropolis, are made of 4 components: economic, social, territorial, physical, and institutional. And each of those components has an objective in itself, no?
Correct.
The economic component, the objective is efficiency. The social component, the objective is equity. The environmental component, the physical one, is sustainability. And the institutional component, which is the one that has to find the balance between those three components, which generally are fighting each other, no?
Correct.
If you do an economic expansion without taking into account the environment, you are killing yourself for the future. If you don't take into account equity, you will end up with a society which will be conflictive, unjust, and it will not work. So all those the three components are fighting each other, and it's the institutional component that has to find the balance, no?
Correct.
And the objective of the institutional component, governance, is equilibrium. So you see, economy is efficiency, society, social is equity, environment is sustainability. So it's only one part of the whole metropolis, and then institutional is equilibrium. So we have to look for these elements. Metropolis are much more sustainable than spreading those people around in the countryside, because they will destroy the environment. So concentrating people, obviously the result is more difficult to manage, no? But obviously things that work well are more difficult to manage. That's why you are ahead of the others, if you know how to manage those things that work well, no? But if we spread the population around the world, we planners, we know that we cannot allow for the sprawl of cities, no? Because we are killing more and more land around. So we are densifying and concentrating, because that way you can manage the emissions better and the negative effects of one and the other, no? So concentration is good, and that is the way we are trying to manage that, no? Obviously with the COVID, we had a problem with those densities and so on, but once the COVID is over, we will go on. In Europe, and probably in India as well, in Europe, we have had pandemias every 80 years.
Correct.
And the process is very easy. At the beginning, the pandemia grows very fast. We even have calculated that the medieval pandemias expanded at 20 kilometers per day. Expands very fast. The very wealthy leave the city and go to the country houses. The less wealthy get into the palaces in the city, but do not meet other people, and they pay the poor to do the dirty jobs, and it's the poor who die. And once after 2 years or 3 years, there has been this horde capacity to react, and then the pandemia goes away, and those cities, after the pandemic is gone, go back exactly to the same position they were before, because cities are made for efficiency, for production, and pandemias are only once every 80 years, no? So people forget about the mind of man, of the human mind, is very good at forgetting what it doesn't want to remember. So once the pandemic is off, people go back to the natural way cities have been developing since. So we have spent so much time discussing how we have to change cities with the COVID pandemic that that's a loss of time. We have to be aware. We have to know how to react. Once we have a pandemic, we were not prepared, but that doesn't mean that we have to change the city. We have to change the way we use the city. So yes, we are producing a method of building those metropolises, which are really the core of production of the world, in a way that we have higher density, higher connectivity, and all that produces not only those environment effects, but as well efficiency. Economies of scale. Economies of scale is a principle that we know well in economics, and we apply the same principle, but we change the name. We generally say economies of agglomeration, but its economies of scale are good as well in metropolis. As I mentioned before, 25% of the population of the world live in 500 metropolises, and they produce 75% of the GDP of the world. So a metropolitan citizen produces 16 times more than a non-metropolitan citizen and a rural citizen. And that efficiency of the metropolis is immense, and that's why metropolis are growing so fast. In the last 70 years, the metropolis have been there were only three cities, metropolises with more than 700,000 inhabitants in the history of the world. And now we have 500. And those 500 have all grown in the 20th century and mainly after Second World War. So metropolis is not a problem or an issue for the future, is already a problem and an issue of the recent past and the actual present.
It is very interesting to know the facts that you share, especially on these numbers, that metropolises make the entire system more efficient, which, I mean, looking at the numbers that you mentioned, I don't think that can be denied that overall, in terms of efficiency of delivery of services, metros kind of make it better. And it is also good to know that cities are more resilient compared to sprawled centers or towns and villages spread across a vast geographical area in terms of dealing with pandemic. That's interesting.
Let me interrupt you a second because it is important. That is not the general perception of people about metropolis. They see a metropolis, they see a mess. They see traffic problems, they see pollution, they see poverty, they see slums, they see hunger, they see the problems of the metropolis. But that is when you don't know how to manage a metropolis. If you go to Stockholm, you don't see that. And the issue is that we don't have image. I would like to use an image. You know, there is a curve called the curve of Wundt that it was a psychologue of the 19th century German, and he made a curve that works for perception of art and many other things. And the curve, when you increase the use of a space, you increase the efficiency. Obviously, if you put 3 trucks instead of none in a road, you are increasing the efficiency. But there is a moment when you reach the point of congestion. That means that when you put another truck, all the trucks which are actually in the road are going to go slower and are going to be less productive. So the adding of one truck reduces the productivity of all the rest. And then if you go on, at the end, if you put all the trucks in the road is going to be absolutely collapsed, and all the trucks will be in a gridlock jam and will not work. So you reach productivity 0 when you reach that. So you see there is a curve. That means that if you go beyond the limit of congestion, you are not doing it right. And obviously, if you arrive to collapse, you are doing it very wrong. No, I generally say that if you take more than 1 hour to get to your job, change your mayor. Because the good metropolis at work, you take between 30 to 40 minutes to get to your job. If your mayor is not able to get you in 1 hour to your job, he's not managing the metropolis right, so you should change your mayor. No? So when we see the metropolis and we see the mess they are in, is not the fault of the metropolis. It's not because the metropolis is not more efficient. It is more efficient. It is because the people that are managing that metropolis are not able, are not capable, do not know how to manage that metropolis, and the result is that congestion or collapse.
Yes, Pedro, that was a good point that you brought out in the conversation, which perfectly leads me to my final question on this topic. You did mention about people's perception of metropolis, and it is fair to a large extent of what you said. That is how generally it is perceived, because everyone, when they go out and see the visible congestion and visible stress that is accompanying that, people they don't consider it as a boon and they don't see the efficiency. Now, on a final note, what would you suggest to change this perception of citizens in living in the metropolis as we head to 2050 or 2070 targets of getting to net zero, which again, for that, cities have to play a big part because the resources are to be equally distributed and cities are going to consume a lot of resources. So what is your point on how we can change this perception of people?
Well, you raise a very relevant point for the future. No? First, metropolis, people like metropolis. That's why they are moving from rural areas to metropolises. And you vote with your feet, no? So they might have many negative aspects, and we mentioned some. I remember Sartre, the French philosopher, used that you only realize things exist when they don't work, no? When things work well, you open a door, you go through the door. Well, you don't care about the door. It's when the door doesn't open that you really damn the door. No? So we see in the metropolis the things that do not work, but we don't realize all the other things that work, and that's the GDP, that's the production of many cultural and interactions and creativity and production and so on. I'm not going to go into that because that will take 3 hours and a half. No. So people are moving to metropolises, and that's a fact, and that means that metropolis have more good than bad. No.
Right.
And so what is the future of that process? Obviously, we have to be able to manage those metropolises, no? And that's what we are trying to do, what we are trying to manage, and that's why I'm involved with the Indian government and the European Union. And so metropolis are not only working, but they have to work better. And metropolis need a governance that will allow them to make decisions that will improve those benefits. No, you cannot run a metropolis from central government, and you cannot run a metropolis by adding up the municipalities that are within a metropolis. Remember that a metropolis is a set of urban units, municipalities that share a daily significant commuting. Is not a conurbation. Is not a mass of buildings that go up to the horizon and beyond. No, that is not a metropolis. That is the cancer. That is the metastasis of a metropolis. A metropolis is different sets of cities that link and work together like the pieces of a chessboard. No, and you cannot make that efficient if it's run from central government, or it is the adding up the disjointed incrementalism of the policies of the different municipalities. So a metropolis needs a government in itself. And in many countries, central governments are very much afraid of those metropolitan governments. Why? Because, for instance, in Manila is 70% of the GDP of the Philippines. Cairo is 66% of the GDP of Egypt. Buenos Aires is 70% of the GDP of Argentina. Do you imagine a president, now Ferdinand Marcos Jr., president of Manila the last 2 or 3 days?
Correct.
Do you imagine a president that will allow a metropolis to have a governor that will govern 70% of the GDP of its country? No way. The governor next day will ask the president, go home, because you're really the one which is running this country. 70% of the GDP is me, no? So central governments are very much afraid of those metropolis in those kind of cases. As a matter of fact, when they are not afraid, is like in countries that have many metropolises and they share a smaller figure in terms of the absolute value of the GDP of the country. For instance, Germany, Frankfurt is 6% of the GDP of Germany. China, Shanghai is 6% of the GDP of China. Italy, Milan is 5% of the GDP of Italy, and so on. In those areas, then the presidents do not mind to have metropolitan governors that will manage those metropolises together. And India is a very good example as well. I think the figures for India is Mumbai is to the 11% of the GDP of India. No?
Correct.
So in those circumstances, you can have that metropolitan. In a situation like India, where you're a federation, that integration of metropolitan policies is not to be done by New Delhi. New Delhi might help, because New Delhi is the one that has the money to make the big investments the metropolis need. But it has to be managed by the local state, Maharashtra state. The chief minister is really the one which is responsible of Mumbai metropolis. You cannot ask the mayor of Mumbai to take care of Thane or all the other cities around the metropolis. So it's really the chief minister, the states, and you have to build up that kind of institutional framework for governance to make India metropolis efficient, and it's the metropolis of India that will position India in the world global role that India deserves.
Right.
India is going to be one of the three big powers of the world, no? The Western group, China and India. And India deserves to be there. And the ones that are going to put India there are the Indian metropolises. So you really need the Indian metropolis to work, because if the metropolis of a country do not work, the country does not work. And this is really the challenge we have for the future, to give those metropolis the right framework to be efficient, equitable, sustainable, and with a governance equilibrium.
Well, that's a wonderful note to kind of end this conversation. You need to give the metropolis the support that they need to ensure that there is sustainability as a whole that is possible in the metropolis, and you need to have that levers between the center and the state, or sort of coordination between them, so that both of them understand that it is a win-win for both.
It is.
If the metropolis kind of is able to generate more revenue and also help people live a happy life there.
And the metropolis, related to the question you put forward that I forgot in the process of answering, metropolis are much more productive of the rest of the country. But that doesn't mean that metropolis should keep the wealth for themselves. They have to share that wealth. So we have to provide the metropolis with the capacity to be productive, but we have to have the fiscal system to shift that extra capacity to the areas that have the need, because all the citizens of the country have the right to have the same kind of social services and provision of their needs, no? So we have to be able to produce, to make those metropolis be competitive internationally and position India and themselves into the global market. But that benefit has to benefit the whole country. So we have to have a transfer of those benefits to the rural area and to the smaller towns. The metropolis cannot forget the rest of the country. And that transfer is really the role of central government.
Fair. I couldn't agree more. That's an interesting point to kind of wrap this conversation on, Pedro. It's been an insightful conversation, I must admit, because the podcast generally covers a range of topics around getting to net zero. But one of the key aspects of this is the new infrastructure that is yet to be built. So if we have to get to net zero, we'll also have to get more people adopt sustainable practices, ensure that they have all the access to that they need for development. They shouldn't be left behind. And one of that is developing new cities where people are going to come and live. So what goes into building the cities, and what are the steps that the different governments, both at the center, state and city level, have to take to ensure that there is equity in this transition, is something that I found it really useful in this conversation. And it goes back right to your days in your political career, from where you had a big inspiration to kind of have an impact. So the entire thing weaves in very well into this conversation. And thank you very much for taking time to join me on the podcast today.
I was very happy, delighted to be with you and with all your listeners. Thank you.
Well, conversations with global experts can't get any better than the one we had today. I have been following Pedro's work ever since I was introduced to it by my friend Alejandro. You should definitely follow Pedro's works on his websites and also on LinkedIn. I will leave the links to connect on the show notes section of this episode. While you are there, you should also check terrageneration.com, our friends who are behind the episode artworks for the show. Terra Generation is a content agency specialized in telling stories in climate, biodiversity and sustainability. So with that, this is Girish Shivakumar signing off, and as always, thank you for listening.